Good morning and welcome to this morning's Big Issue debate. My name is Ed Johnson and I'm the managing editor for Bloomberg News in Australia. It's my absolute pleasure to be moderating today's discussion. Is a cyber 9/11 event inevitable? We've got a distinguished panel today to steer us through this topic, so let me introduce them to you and we can get underway. On my immediate right here we have Troy Hunt. Troy is an independent security consultant and cybersecurity researcher. Troy has authored courses for technology learning platform Pluralsight, and he's the creator of the Have I Been Pwned website, which helps people establish if they've been hit by malicious activity on the internet. Next along we have Jacqueline McNamara, head of cybersecurity for Telstra. Jackie has been in the cybersecurity field for more than 2 decades, including stints at IBM and HP, and she's a former intelligence officer with the Australian Defence Force. And Dmitry Samartsev is the CEO of BI.ZONE, the cybersecurity division of the largest bank in Russia and Eastern Europe, Sberbank. BI.ZONE cooperates closely with several global organizations such as Interpol and the World Economic Forum and specializes in threat intelligence, forensic analysis, and investigations and monitoring the dark web. So welcome to you all. Thanks for coming along. We've got some fascinating ground to cover. I do encourage you as audience members to use the Cybos app or also the web browser to submit questions and also to participate in our audience polling. I will try to get to as many of the audience questions as I can during the hour that we have with you. Before we go any further, though, I think what we really need to try to get an idea of is what a seismic 9/11 event would look like. Troy, can you get us started? We've seen the audience respond in the word cloud there earlier. We've got things like fraud, crime, nation-state attacks, ransomware, even Skynet and Terminator. But what keeps you awake at night? What gives you bad dreams? Can you paint some of the worst case scenarios of what the big one would look like?
Well, I'll give you several different scenarios because I think there's many shapes that it could take. And I've got 3 examples where we have seen precedents that give us a little bit of insight into what it might look like. So I think, first of all, many of us think about some sort of serious cyber event, meaning loss of services. So think about it as individuals. If we no longer had internet and we no longer had messaging, we no longer had email or social network, that would have a massive impact on our everyday lives. Back in 2012, when we had protests against SOPA and PIPA, the Stop Online Piracy events, the internet, a large part of the internet, went dark for a day. So Wikipedia went dark. People lost their minds. Like they were kids going, I don't know what to do when I don't have Wikipedia available. And we kind of got this little glimpse of just how crazy like normal everyday life can be for a well-planned event. But if we take it further and we start going commercially, what does it look like for businesses and for professional services when we start losing internet or when we start losing availability? If we think about last year, there was the WannaCry ransomware. It took the National Health Service in the UK down for days and days, and there are literally like people who can no longer go and see doctors. There are operations that were put back. It had a serious impact on health. And if we go a step further and say, what about critical infrastructure? Because this is the one people are most worried about, because power plants and nuclear facilities, electricity, like everything is now connected in one way or another. And last month we saw gas explosions in Massachusetts. And apparently about 40 homes, like things just blew up in the house. And that was interesting because people started popping up and they go, maybe this is weaponized Stuxnet, you know, like maybe this is Stuxnet being the malicious software that infiltrated nuclear power plants in Iran, you know, maybe it's that. And the interesting thing with that is that it wasn't a cyber event. It was like one bloke inadvertently installing the wrong pressure regulator. But we're starting to see what can happen when things go wrong in a way that it could be explained by a cyber attack. And I just find it curious now that when things just naturally, by organic purposes, go wrong, it's indistinguishable from what it might look like if there was malicious activity. So I think it's interesting to sort of look at this whole spectrum and consider all the different ways it can impact you. And the last thing is just sort of go from like homes exploding and gas attacks. We saw a couple of years ago connected services with IoT devices to feed your pets going down. So PetNet was the product, went down. Animals weren't fed for 10 hours. So we have this massive spectrum of like things blowing up through to like Fluffy dying because he weren't able to feed the cat. So I think a cyber 9/11 could take all of these different sort of areas of impact, but amplify them over and over and over again. And that's sort of what worries me, the loss of really critical services to our daily lives.
Right. And Jackie, are they the kind of scenarios that you plan for at Telstra? I mean, as Australia's largest telco provider, you're the backbone of critical infrastructure. Surely that would make you a prime target for malicious hacking activity and a cyber 9/11 style attack.
I don't think we've done a red team exercise with the PetNet. Fluffy wasn't fed. But we have certainly looked at a number of scenarios. And obviously, what's really interesting is that there's obviously a lot of sensationalism around cyber, etc. But the reality is that planning for network resilience and other events or outage events is something that telcos do as a matter of course. And so, yes, we're absolutely planning for those. Yes, we do red team those types of scenarios. And Telstra's obviously investing $3 billion in Network 2020. So there's a serious amount of work going into network resilience. And I think with the capability of 5G coming down the line, we're going to see less interdependence on backhaul cables as well as mobile devices, so you won't, have the same vulnerability, if you like, to a single cable going down because you'll have a more spread, network. Although obviously significant backhaul links will still be impacted. They're quite hard to get to though, and often kind of need a physical response. Although some, as outages sort of don't work that way. So look, yes, we do plan for that, and yes, obviously as part of the critical infrastructure program in Australia, we absolutely work with the government and other similar entities to make sure that our resilience is where it should be. And we've got quite a large security team who's well regarded as well, constantly looking for everything, including outlying events, and trying to explain those.
If I can ask you to put your hat back on as a former intelligence officer and sort of assess our state of preparedness in Australia, how much work are you aware has gone on behind the scenes at a governmental level and intelligence agency level to make sure that those legacy systems across the power grid and transportation, water, etc., could withstand such an attack?
So I'm actually really pleased that Mike Burgess, who's our ex-CISO, is now running the Australian Signals Directorate, which everybody should be breathing a sigh of relief in Australia in terms of having a safe pair of hands looking at the problem and coordinating the impact. And obviously we've also had the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, and unfortunately Al Mac couldn't be with us today, but certainly they have done a lot of work in ensuring that there's collaborative frameworks between business and government in terms of managing infrastructure, because I think, as Troy referenced, although perhaps not the PetNet, but when you have significant impact to financial systems, or people can't get to their money, or there's other commercial applications of these types of network requiring problems, they can cause just as much duress to the system as a major network outage, for example. So
let me pick up on that with you, Dmitry. Jackie said people not being able to get to their money. We've been focusing in on what an attack on critical infrastructure might look like. How would a game-changing attack on the financial system play out?
So I think the game has been changed right now. So, and what we can see from our security systems, their capacity of organized cybercrime, which is going from the dark web, is raising 2 times in a year. So if we're talking from 16 to 17, from 17 to 18, from 17 to 18, it would be more than 3 times. So what we can see, that all this geopolitical turbulence and all this bureaucracy between governments lead organized cybercrime to attack more and more, and a lot of attacks are successful. So the banks around the globe and the client of the banks, the corporate players and the private entities, they are losing money. And according to the World Economic Statistics, in 2017, the world economy loses from organized cybercrime was amounted $1 trillion. It's DDP of Norway and Finland together Could you imagine it? And it's raising. And if it will raise in 2 or 3 times, could you imagine the capacity and financial capacity of dark web, which can invest all this financial and all this money to the new tools, to AI tools, and to develop it. So I think that the main threat is going from the dark web, not from the governments, not from the terrorists, not from the hacktivists, and now it's going from organized cybercrime, and we have to do something with that. I think on corporate level, while the governments are arguing.
But if there was an organized, concerted attack on a major financial institution, how would that ripple through the economy of a country and then go global? What are some of the scenarios that would play out?
The worst scenario is when cybercrime is making several attacks in the one time. For example, they're making DDoS, and then they're making, in the same time, they're making huge informational attack in social networks, just a fake news that the biggest banks are going down. So, and could you imagine what domino effect will happen with just the citizens who will go to the branches of the bank and try to take their money back and they put it to the mattress? Could you imagine what will happen? So this is troubles with liquidity, the troubles with central banks, so the troubles with government, and it might be a very terrible thing. So, and we have to organize cybercrime is they have no borders, and we have to collaborate and cooperate between countries, between companies, on the corporate level, between central banks to make an internet safer place.
We've started touching on the main source of where this activity, the malicious activities, is coming from. And before we go any further, I want to check in with our audience again. Get your devices ready, because we're going to have the next of our audience polling questions. The next one is, what would be the most likely group behind a cyber 9/11 attack? If you're there with your fingers on the button, I'm going to give you 10 seconds to respond to that, and then we'll autopsy those results. It's moving around a little bit, but it's looking like a clear winner. Yeah, so we've got 45% nation states, followed by organized crime, cyber terrorism at 16%, hacktivists at 4%, and then malicious or unwitting insiders at 2% there. Dmitry, does that tally with your experience? Sberbank is subjected to more attacks, I believe, than any other institution in your region, you know, Russia and Eastern Europe. Where are those attacks coming from? Is that nation states? Do you share the view that nation states are the biggest threat, or is it more so cybercrime?
So even if nation states are attacking us, we can't consider it. So, and what we see is just systemic malicious activity against our group and our clients from dark web, from organized cybercrime. So while we are holding more than 50% of Russian financial market, so of course we are the main goal. And of course we have to protect ourselves, we have to protect our clients, and because of that we had to develop a most advanced cybersecurity platform in our region. So, and this is a very good thing that we're a corporate entity which has a lot of information regarding Russian-speaking dark web, and we are ready to share. So, and while, because of that, we are working on international level, attending conferences, and using the platforms like SWIFT or World Economic Forum to share this knowledge with the rest of the world. So, and today we will hold, after 1 hour, I think, or something like that, we will hold a special session just for deep diving to the Russian-speaking dark web.
You've mentioned the dark web a few times now, and this actually is pertinent to one of the questions that's come in from the audience. The bad guys are really good at sharing. Are there not serious lessons to be learned for the defenders? You know, so much activity is going on in the dark web, so much sharing of information, sharing of tips and strategies. We need to learn from that, right?
We need to do the same, yeah.
Yeah.
actually, but they are 2 steps ahead right now. So we have to do something here.
So China, Russia, North Korea, they've all been identified as key actors in state-sanctioned hacking. Are any of these trends changing? Is anyone else emerging as a threat? Jackie, are you aware through your former intelligence networks?
The
Well,
problem,
yeah,
the problem is that the problem is that when the world is talking about Russian hackers in quotes, and they're mentioning, trying to mention their government, Russian government. But I will tell you the story that Russian government is not technologically advanced enough to do all this shit. So this is a true story. So the real truth is that Russian-speaking dark web and Russian-speaking cyber gang community, it's much wider than Russia. So there are a lot of people in Ukraine, in Belarus, in Kazakhstan, in Kyrgyzstan, and 15 more countries in Romania, which are talking Russian and doing bad things, but actually they might be even no Russians. So, like Chinese-speaking dark web, Russian-speaking dark web, English-speaking dark web, there are Indian-speaking, Hindi-speaking dark web, so there are several points of collaboration of cyber criminals, and they are very effective. So we have to do the same thing, but on the legal way, and we have to build a legal environment for that. So maybe it should be a UN convention from the government state side, but from the corporate side, we just to have protect us, share the information, and protect our clients, finish story. And just to break all this ice and break all this turbulence and just start to work against cybercrime.
And I think probably that would be my feedback, not that I have a brief from any of our intelligence agencies, but I think the issue that we have, and we were talking about this in the room prior, is that there's a lot of financial incentive for cyber criminals to get on with it and collaborate and use any means necessary to do the best that they can there. Unfortunately, and we all think it, when we go to things where we are just going to collaborate and share information, we tend to think of it as a distraction from our normal job. How will we find the time to get away to that conference and discuss things? But we actually really need to see it as part of proactive planning for cyber events. Certainly in relation to, I guess, the interesting thing about a massive 911 attack, I think Dmitry would probably agree that for most of the cyber criminals, a massive cyber event wouldn't actually be that great, because if the financial system loses liquidity, they lose their access to cash, right? So that's going to really mess with their operating model. So I think nation states probably are the right answer there, but maybe for not quite the same reason. So yeah, I think we really need to start thinking about the processing of, or the understanding of information and the sharing of information, dissemination of information as a practice that we engage in regularly, not as something that we kind of go to if we've got a bit of time off work. It is the work, and more it will become the most important work. It almost should be kind of 50% information sharing and collaboration, and 50% managing the things that you need to do. Unfortunately, especially in the cyber space, we're all resource constrained, so we need to find better ways to share information. I think actually there's a really good case for that around attribution. I've had several I'd be interested to have a chat with both of you here in terms of attribution. There's obviously an amount of it that needs to go on, and Telstra probably has resources to do some of that, and obviously the ASD is collaborating with us as well to do that. But I think attribution really should be a team sport, something that we can all do effectively, because really it's kind of a waste of time. And interestingly, Dmitry's kind of note of a false flag. The Russian government, I assure you, hasn't got the capability. Maybe we could just ask Dmitry who's doing it, as opposed to spending all the time on attribution. So I'd be interested in the other thoughts here.
In terms of that level of collaboration that we need and that we're seeing in the private sector level, we're also in a period of extraordinary geopolitical tension. The US-China trade war, the tensions between the UK and Russia, between the US and Russia, over the meddling in the US elections. That level of geopolitical tension, does that make it fundamentally impossible for nation states to cooperate at the level necessary to tackle the threat of cyber criminals?
Unfortunately, yes. What we can consider while we are working with Interpol in their global complex for innovations in global investigation, that law enforcement between these main countries, which is EU, UK, Russia, and some kind of Asia-Pacific region, including Australia. So law enforcement agencies and polices, they are not exchanging the information at all. But actually, in the connection of the, for example, Sberbank and Amazon and Google and Barclays Bank, we can actually identify the criminal based on our data and just to not break even one law in the global scale. But we have to deliver this information to somebody who will go and catch this guy. And for that point, we need law enforcement agencies, and not in one country, because cyber criminals, they are decentralized. They can sit, for example, 30 people from one group, they can sit in 20 countries and just making the bad deals. These guys even cannot know each other, and they just know their nicknames and communicate it and collaborating. So how we will solve this issue and this most pressing issue in this geopolitical time, I don't know. But what we can do, and we can share IOCs between corporate players and make cyber criminals' job more difficult and more expensive. This is in cybercrime world, it's just like the typical business. You know that they're making investments, buying tools, developing them, then delivering, and make profit. So if we will make the preparation of attack is very expensive, they will never do that because there will no margin. So let's try. While these governments are arguing on corporate level, we can try to do our best to protect actually our clients, which are citizens of the world.
Troy, let me bring you back in. Clearly, we're in the midst of an arms race. You know, we've got groups of highly sophisticated criminal gangs deploying ever more sophisticated technology to breach the defenses of multinational companies and big financial institutions. Can you talk us through some of the strategies that are employed? Just how sophisticated are these groups, and what are some of the techniques that they're using in the attacks that we're witnessing?
Well, firstly, I think Dmitry's point just there was very poignant, because it's effectively ROI, right? So if you increase the cost, then suddenly the value of the activity goes down. And that works for the likes of organised crime. It's a little less effective, I think, on nation states, terrorists, hacktivists, because they have a different sense of what the return on the investment is. In terms of techniques people are using, you know, one of the things that seems to be a common denominator through so many attacks today is social engineering attacks. And social engineering attacks cover things like phishing. We saw up on the tag cloud before, there was smishing, SMS phishing. And this is just consistently effective, and it's also, no matter how good the technical controls are we build, at the end of the day we've still got this organic human matter controlling it that is so continuously subject to these attacks. So, you know, that's one of the things that worries me the most. And in fact, that's one of the things that we constantly see the likes of hacktivists doing very, very well. You know, they're very often children. Those of you who've got kids know how good they are at social engineering. And they're enormously effective at breaking through these defences. So that's one of the things that continually worries me, despite all the technical controls that we get in place, and it's the vulnerability of humans.
I've been getting dozens of phone calls a week from Latvia, which I've now managed to block. I haven't answered one of them. Is that likely to be a phishing technique? Have you come across that one?
Depends what you've been doing in Latvia, I guess.
My wife's been getting them as well. So.
Look, I mean, all of you have probably been at the receiving end of phishing-style attempts. Now, whether that's in your email, I mean, have a look at your junk mail. There'll be dozens in there. Many of you have probably gotten those phone calls. You know, the ones you get from the ATO saying you've got to pay your bill or they're going to come and arrest you? Yeah, don't worry about those. You know, most of the time, every now and then it might be true, but most of the time they are automated attacks preying on the propensity of humans to be trusting of the person who's calling. And particularly when phishing attacks start to get more sophisticated too. So think about the amount of personal data you have out there on the internet which has been publicly disclosed through things like data breaches. If you're on LinkedIn, you've probably been in the data breach. If you're on Dropbox, you've probably been in a data breach. And attackers get this information and they craft their attacks deliberately targeted at you. So one of the ones that we've seen that's been enormously prevalent the last few months is a sextortion attack. And what they do is they go through the data breaches, they get passwords that you have used in a data breach, and then they send you an email saying, we have caught you looking at pornography, here is your password to prove that we know who you are. And like whether you have or whether you haven't isn't really the point, because you have this moment where you go, this is actually my password. Like they know something about me. And this is a great example of sort of gaining confidence in creating an air of authenticity such that people do end up paying the Bitcoin ransom to make sure that their browser history isn't released.
I want to move on now and cover some ground around how prepared we are to withstand serious criminal activity. You know, we've got an audience largely of finance professionals, so we'll hone in on that area. You know, that 2016 attack on the Bangladesh Central Bank really did show the vulnerability of the global financial system, and the sum of money lost each year, Dmitry touched on this, is just staggering, which suggests in itself that not enough is being done to keep banks ahead in this global cat and mouse game against the bad guys out there, the cyber criminals. Let's turn to the audience again with our next audience poll. So get your devices ready. We'll have 10 seconds again. On a scale of 1 to 10, as a collective financial services industry, how prepared are we to respond to and recover from a serious cyber attack? So 1 would be not prepared at all, and 10 would be fully prepared. So let's start the clock there.
So not bad.
Not bad. Not bad. Not many people confident. Largest grouping is 3.
That's dire.
Yeah. Dmitry, is the industry taking the threat seriously enough?
No. Actually, you can buy, let us talk in allegories. You can buy the Ferrari, but when you can drive, it will lead you to the huge crash and a huge accident. So you can buy the best technological solutions to protect you, but if you will not teach your employees, and if you will not teach the citizens and your clients, it would be the huge amount of losers if we're talking about it. So, and you have mentioned the social engineering. So this is a typical thing when somebody is trying to call and just to make the person to send the money back. But we have, of course, very technologically advanced transactional anti-fraud system. But nobody wants to use, when the bank is calling to you and talking that, okay, your transaction is blocked, you are just screaming that, oh, unblock it. But when you recognize that it was a theft, you are calling back to the bank and, oh, you were right, and could you please send my money back? But the money was lost. So, and the problem is that we have to increase level of cyber hygiene, and it's very important. So we know how to wash our hands before we eat. And our planet has solved a huge amount of troubles with stomach infection because of that. But now we have to teach people how to behave in cyberspace. And this should be an intergovernmental program, just to teach and to make sure that they understand what it is. So inside our group and inside our region, we're trying to do these social things with the people. We're making special advertisement and et cetera, and we're phishing our employees on the daily basis. For example, so our Sberbank team this morning received the phishing emails and just 100% of employees which are presented on Cybers was calling to me in the morning and say, oh, I recognize that it was you, so it was your phishing email. So, but it was a long process which we have been implemented in 3 years. So the first result was 60% of our 300,000 employees, they were clicking on these links. Could you imagine? You just need only one person who clicked to infect whole corporation. It was 60%. But now it's less than 1%. So, and it's just a regular employment and just regular change of employment in our company just during the quarter. So, and this is very good result. So I think that such kind of practice have to be implemented in all companies and the governance around the globe.
Are you doing similar work at Telstra? What's Telstra's level of cyber hygiene?
We are, and obviously we're quite focused on it. We've got a large cyber influence team, which is run by Blair Adamson, who's an awesome hand in terms of getting this and being quite market leading in terms of the techniques that he's using. But it's really interesting you say that. We've also had a phishing series that has lasted for about 3 years, and we had some great stories, straight up. I remember the first one that we actually said there was a parcel for you, and we didn't actually say it was in the mailroom, so we kind of didn't think of this effect, but we actually got calls from the mailrooms in all of our cities, particularly some of the smarter mailroom people, to go, is there something going on with the email? Because I've got a queue of people looking for their parcel, and people were actually like arguing with the mailroom guy, no, my email says I've got a parcel. So we've come, I guess, a long way from there, but interestingly, we did one actually a week or two ago that sent, and this really makes me laugh quite a lot, sent someone's payslip. So, oh, here's blah, blah, here's your payslip. Can you open it? Now, I actually gave it a quick cursory glance and only later thought that's probably a phishing email. I thought, oh, well, I shouldn't open someone else's payslip. But 60% of people did. So
it was the beginning of the way.
That's it. The other phishing attacks, people have started to go, oh yeah, I shouldn't click on that link, etc. But no one can resist looking at somebody's payslip. So that was a really interesting test. In social engineering, there's always a way around it. And I think one of the big things for me, and this is where one of my pet topics, which is diversity and inclusion in cyber, comes in. I think we've got a lot of awesome technical people, and I don't think, we used to do cyber by putting everything in behind the barriers and sticking firewalls around it and turning things off and air gapping, and that was how you did stuff. And now that we're so connected and most of the power is in, the phones and, all the control moves right back towards the user, we haven't invested going along in a really comprehensive cyber influence program. And so we've got a generation of kids, and I think Troy was talking about it, who just put everything, on the internet. So, we need to start saying to them, you need to think about the control of that data, when you actually pick the data up. So if that's not a photo that you want on the internet, consider whether you take it, and if you do take it, maybe don't share it to iCloud, or how do you secure that? Think of the whole security life cycle at the start, and getting that awareness across the board is a thing that really needs to be focused on, and often really technical coding people aren't the best people to engage with the user base to do that. So attracting people with really good soft skills, communication skills and engagement skills is a critical part of our industry, being able to shift gears and be more comprehensive for the world, right? Because it's a every consumer, every person problem now, not just an individual banking, a government or a individual company problem.
You talk about sharing of data and also loading stuff up onto the cloud. One of the questions that's come in from the audience: are the commercial cloud providers safe or susceptible to a cyber 9/11? Troy, what's your response to that?
I always find the safe or secure question interesting. I hear this a lot, and people generally go, is such and such safe? And they really want a yes or a no answer. It's a lot more nuanced than that. I mean, let's take something like Apple. You can configure your Apple devices and your iClouds in very highly secure fashions. You can have a strong password. They have two-factor authentication. You can use Face ID, Touch ID, biometric authentication without possibly using a PIN that you use somewhere else. So you can use these services in wonderfully secure ways. or you can have a phone with no pin and leave it on a bar, and then you've got all your photos and things on there. So I think that the answer to this is that the sort of consumer-facing commercial-grade stuff, whether it be the Apples, the Microsofts, the Googles of the world, you can use in very highly secure fashions, and we've got to sort of drive people more towards that. But the challenge we have, and I think Dmitry sort of touched on this at the start of his piece before, is that sometimes this requires friction. And people genuinely don't like adding friction even when they get a security upside. If you've ever made a large financial transaction, for example, and you just want it to go through, and it's stuff like the banks say, well, we want to call you and we want to check, and then maybe you're not there, and there's this friction to the process, and people get upset about that without realising the benefit it gives. And also, the penny just dropped. How much time have we been spending talking about vulnerability in people versus systems? Isn't that interesting? We spent the whole time talking about humans messing things up, which seems to be a recurring theme.
Yeah. On that, systems, there's been a fair bit of debate about utility versus security. As in, the easier it is to use something, the harder it is to make it safe. What are the risks for us then as we become increasingly connected to the internet in our day-to-day lives? I mean, there are millions and millions of devices now that are connected. We seem to spend our lives, getting a ride home by booking a ride on Uber, to paying for our meals, to ordering food for the fridge. Is the cyber world getting more dangerous as more and more devices get connected to it? And is the threat growing exponentially because of that?
To be honest, I take a little bit of an issue with the assertion that adding security always makes things harder as well. There are certainly cases where it does, things like the transaction verification. But think about the way you authenticate to say, a modern iPhone today. Like, that is easier than entering a PIN. Like, you just pick it up and look at it, and it just, that's almost magical. In terms of things like logging onto websites, we have very good dedicated password manager products now that let you create strong, like genuinely crazy random strings for your password. And when you log on to a website, you push a button and your Face ID and it's automatic. That's easier than entering that terrible 8-character password that all of you probably use everywhere else. So go and get a password manager to do that. So there are technologies that actually do achieve both objectives, and I think we've got more of those than ever. The trick again, and we're back to people again, is helping people understand that the technologies are there and how to use them effectively.
Do you find that with your customers and your end users? Do people get troubled and annoyed at the level of security they need to put in, or?
Arguably, there are more things that annoy customers at Telstra than levels of security, I think. I can tell the Australians in the room by the laughter there. Obviously we're going through a big digitisation program as a company and trying to engage better with our customers. And look, I think one of the good things that I've seen going forward is that Telstra are seen as a relatively secure provider, and that's seen as a benefit. And so, there's less resistance to asking those identity questions and understanding the kind of basis of identity. So, I think customers are getting a little bit more educated in terms of, not being really annoyed about it, etc. But we're still seeing, significant problems. We had a customer who's a bank come to us the other day and say, look, what can we do? And they're having call centres offshore who actually are buying VoIP services here, which is probably how we're going to get them with, the cybersecurity centres. So in terms of the law enforcement problem, and they're calling up and, as you say, socially engineering data. And there was a case the other day, a retired court justice, where they had gotten him to log into his system, so it was legitimately him logging into his banking system and transferring $90,000 of his own money into somebody else's account, which seems incredible to, all the people on the stage were like, what were you doing? And he actually took them to court and said there should be systems in place to stop me doing that when I'm being socially engineered. And he's actually won the case. So the banks had to refund his money, and they've come to us and said, like, how do we work with the telcos to kind of shut that down? And actually we'll probably end up doing some sort of VoIP service and looking at how we can implement some overarching security into those calls, or two-factor authentication that's shared between bank and telco. But it's not an easy problem to solve. That's actually quite a hard one, because most of the work's being done offshore, and we don't, again, have the intergovernmental law enforcement mechanisms. So, we know who it is.
But I think the trouble is, that we're talking about what will happen when all devices in the world would be, including the microwaves and fridges and cat feeders, would be connected to the internet. I think that if we will try to consider what is happening now with GDPR, with all this punishment to poor Zuckerberg, which is, which has to wear the suit, I think the second time, and his wife, the first was when he was graduating the university. So, and now you can, if you can try to consider all of this, the governments and the politicians, which know nothing about technologies, trying to build digital walls, just changing the laws. So I think it will lead the world to the situation when all devices are extremely disconnected from the internet. Because you know that the simple ICANN resource, which is just WHOIS service, which is helping you to track the holder of IP address, now is switched off. And but this is the main tool for cybersecurity researchers and for investigators to try to find the link to from the cyber gangs, just anonymous cyber gangs, to the real persons. So, and could you imagine that this resource is switched off because of GDPR, and ICANN can do nothing? So, cyber criminals are very happy with that, because now, if I want to receive the information about IP holder and owner of IP address, I have to prepare spatial request from law enforcement. It have to be signed on paper. So, and could you imagine that when you are analyzing 1 billion events per day in your security operations center, if I will try to, so it's 100 million IP address, and I will try to sign 100 million papers and send it to law enforcement, then they will send it somewhere else. So it's a huge bureaucratic trouble, and now we are there. We're on this place. So, and the reason is that the politicians trying to write the laws without technological advisors, technological advanced advisors. So they can call this guy and ask him, okay, please come and advise us how to build all this legal environment. So, but they don't do that. So this is a big trouble, and somebody can solve it, but this is not a corporate issue. So, this is somebody in higher level in the international community, on the governance level, have to do that.
Do the law enforcement agencies have enough tools at their disposal, and are the regulatory settings right? The audience members from Australia will be aware that there's legislation currently before the Australian Parliament where the government is looking to get access to encrypted communications, and it's quite interesting because you've got some tech giants joining forces with civil libertarians to campaign against this legislation. Where do you draw the line between eroding people's privacy and civil liberties, but giving law enforcement agencies the power that they need to tackle a very sophisticated threat? Jackie?
Well, we've only got 17 minutes, I know, but because that's a big question. But certainly, I think things like being able to easily access ICANN and look up IP addresses is a lot more important than accessing the minutiae of encrypted data communications. A lot of it is actually speed. A lot of these transactions are done and complete by the time anyone does it. And in terms of law enforcement, I think looking at the collaborative frameworks between our governments globally and moving towards a more globally centric model for regulation is really important, because fundamentally, yeah, sure, the Australian government might be able to determine attribution and be pretty solid on the attribution as a result of getting into those encrypted communications. Who are they going to call? What will Vlad say? My government can't do anything about it. I don't know where they are, probably, and we can't get access to ICANN, right? So I think there is, as with all things, there's like an 80-20. You need access to enough information to get the job done, and I would argue that there's probably a long tail of sort of minor cases that probably aren't hugely problematic that are in that we need to get it encrypted communications, would be my view. So there are a lot of really important things to solve, and that's better collaboration, intergovernmental agreements on, what to do if they have valid attribution and have found someone who's, interfering with financial systems in more than one country, and, obvious stuff like they need to be able to access ICANN, and we need to maybe track the people who are accessing it, and if they're found to be doing naughty stuff, then we'll look at that later, as opposed to holding the process up in the front end by forcing warrants. So, yeah, I think there are probably bigger fish to fry, would be my view.
Yeah. And in terms of the global order, we've got Geneva Conventions to deal with all manner of threats. Do we need to consider looking again at the global rulebook to take into account the threat of cyber attacks?
I think absolutely. Yeah.
The last global document, which was signed regarding cyberspace, is the Budapest Convention. But could you imagine that it was signed in 2001 and it still was not ratified by even the half of European Union? Russia also didn't ratify it, and even France, for example, and Germany, they haven't ratified it. So there is no one international document which is signed in the UN level or some kind of that level, even on European level, which will regulate cyberspace. It's a huge trouble.
We've got audience questions coming in thick and fast, so I'm gonna hit a few now, fast fire, short answers, and see if we can get through as many of them as we can. Troy, this one's for you. Is cryptocurrency funding the dark web? I know you don't like yes or no answers.
Sometimes. Well, I mean, we've got to remember, before cryptocurrency, we had other forms of currency funding the dark web. So I think if anything, cryptocurrency has made the speed of transactions easier, it's made the anonymity easier, but it's the same problems. I mean, we had malware and ransomware back in the late 80s, and you had to send a cashier's check to Panama. Yeah, we still got the same underlying problem, it's just faster to monetize.
Right, okay. Here's another one. What could be a black swan cybersecurity incident? This touches back on one of the first questions I raised with you, Dmitry, at the start.
We have discussed it, yes, and so on my point of view, so the worst scenario is when financial infrastructure is infected and is broken. So, of course, the telco is also that's very critical, but it's not so easy to block the telco. These guys, they have a lot of redundancy systems. They have reserve systems. They can switch the traffic to another countries. Also, for example, you can switch the traffic and go through Europe, through Australia, through Asia, and so. But if we're talking about financial institutions, this is a real, just the heart of the world now. So the financial system. And the SWIFT is the heart of this financial, the heart of this heart. So, and I think that the security of SWIFT is very important. So, a security of such kind of interbanking, interconnections, money transfer systems. So, and I think that SWIFT they're doing a lot of very interesting things. So, they have developed the cybersecurity program, which is very interesting, and they are just going ahead, and I think they have very good CISO office, and they're collaborating. They're trying to build a platform, and I think that if they will do such kind of things, they will succeed, and the world would be safer a little bit.
I think actually they're really good points, and I think it's actually a really interesting question in terms of a black swan cyber event. I actually think it'll probably be an accident. So, it will probably be the most likely scenario. And, we saw in the, American elections where, there was interference, presumably from Russia or, possibly not the government, from what Dmitry says. I'm trusting him. And actually, probably the biggest impact, although we do have someone in our team that monitors Trump's Twitter feed, so arguably, which does have an impact on, where security events come from. So we find that a great little intelligence tool, actually, an OS int tool. But The other big issue was the whole issue of fake news, okay, and the possible, as Dmitry said, like undermining of, you know, what we actually need to be doing is collaborating, and we're all busy worrying about, is it the Russians? And actually that's probably kind of the wrong question. It's what systems do we have in place to make sure that fake news doesn't undermine the way that we process information and create widespread panic and problems. And I think if I think as a, you know, as a army officer, and look at it strategically, you know, the impact might be to gain money off these people or to do something over here. But in, you know, conducting those operations, and especially if they're operations in, you know, more than one arena, so they look at financial services and they look at social media and they look at, you know, pet feeders, etc., or utilities, like picking a few of those, meaning to have one effect, you know, in terms of a kinetic effect in the real world, and actually having another underlying effect which could, you know, spark widespread panic in the underlying financial system, right? If fake news then, you know, creates a problem that financial transactions aren't okay, and, you know, we actually slow down global banking systems, or people start taking their money out and sticking it in the mattress, it could inadvertently, and, you know, without necessarily being the original idea of the attack, create widespread panic and pretty serious problems. And I think, you know, in terms of the likelihood and what the black swan will be, that would be my view. An intent to, you know, have one operation to steal some money or have a pretty tricky one there, but an unintended consequence that causes widespread catastrophe. And I think that's why we should be really thinking about how we create collaboration and intergovernmental agreement and frameworks, rather than worrying about whose fault it is and was it the Russians. And, you know, I think we focus too much on that.
A lot of our attention in this cybersecurity conversation has been around software. We've got a question in for the audience. What are your thoughts on hardware infiltration attacks by nation states, like the China-driven hardware attack via Supermicro? Now, that's obviously referring to an issue that's been in the news a lot. Just recently, the Bloomberg Business report about Supermicro circuit boards allegedly having little devices put into them, which would then allow backdoor access into servers and communications, etc. Now, obviously, the companies mentioned in that article, Apple and Amazon, have vociferously denied the claims. That's still a point of contention. How big a threat is hardware infiltration? And is that something we should be taking more seriously, do you think, Troy?
It's certainly a risk, and we have seen documented evidence in the past via the likes of the Snowden leaks about the US government doing similar things, although certainly what came out of Ed's releases was things like intercepting hardware in transit to a customer, so it was very targeted. The Supermicro thing was interesting because allegedly, and there are two very different schools of thought in this at the moment, but allegedly this was insertion of chips at manufacturing time, which would then inevitably lead to motherboards going out to all sorts of different organisations. I wonder if the bigger impact of things like Supermicro is the impact in confidence on Chinese sourced materials. So we've already seen the US and the Australian governments being very reticent, and in some cases outright banning equipment from companies like ZTE and Huawei, Chinese organisations. And you end up with this situation where we're now struggling to get access in some cases to cheap, very good components because of the concern about this. And in a story like Supermicro, that concern may be unfounded if Apple and Amazon are right, or it might be something which is actually very serious if the Bloomberg report is right. So I think it's a fascinating area that goes well beyond just the technology alone.
Yeah. I read a fantastic article in prepping for this panel, and I really would encourage people to go out there and read it. A journalist called Andy Greenberg, who writes for Wired magazine, he wrote a fascinating piece on the NotPetya attack. That was the one allegedly carried out by the Russian military to destabilize Ukraine, but it ended up spreading exponentially across the globe and costing an estimated $10 billion worth of damage to the global economy, you know, bringing down the global shipping company Maersk, for instance, for a good couple of weeks. At the end of his piece, Greenberg concludes, and this is quotes, "Global corporations are simply too interconnected, information security too complex, attack surfaces too broad to protect against state-trained hackers bent on releasing the next world-shaking worm. Jackie, do you agree with that? Do you envisage a situation where the threat of attack is so great that global commerce, as we know it, simply isn't possible anymore?
No, I think the game will always be worth the candle. Not that what he says isn't true, and ultimately, when Troy said before, people want a yes or no answer. How do you make something safe? And look, actually, whether they're inserting things in hardware or not, there's always going to be a way to get to those systems, and it might often be socially engineering the person who controls them, right, to get privileged access. So, look, I think there's always going to be a way in, but I think, and this is the way that it is now, that the game is worth the candle, that we're making enough money from these transactions that, this organisation, organised crime is, a fraction of that. But obviously that number is growing, and at a certain point, I guess it'll hit a tipping point. And then we, I hope by that time, we'll have educated our user base enough that social engineering problem isn't there. But the reality is, if there's a way to steal things, people will find it, and that's always been the way. And we've continued to trade with each other, and global trade has grown year on year. So I'm hoping that the upside will continue to grow along with the downside. But we do need to be very conscious that we need a pretty global shift, and we need to work together better and work out how we're going to build a convention, not the Budapest Convention, that everyone agrees to and that we align to, that we start sort of cracking down on this, before that happens.
Dmitry,
I will tell you the real story about NotPetya attack and Maersk. So when the attack was going on, the funny story that the biggest one of the biggest Russian corporation, which is working in the oil industry, was 100% completely stopped and infected. So could you imagine the huge governmental corporation which was infected, but NotPetya, which is mentioned like a Russian government-backed malware? Funny story, yes? And they have lost at least $100 million. Yeah, and Maersk lost 300 million. So while in Russia there were a lot of victims, we had to work against NotPetya. And so after 1 day, our security researchers from BI.ZONE have developed the way to decrypt the files. How to decrypt the files. So the malware developers, they have made several mistakes, and we have found that. So we have shared all this information through all channels which we have. This is we're a member of the FIRST community. We are just associated member of Cyber Defense Alliance in UK, Global Cyber Alliance in the US. There was no World Economic Forum Center for Cybersecurity. It was not established yet in that time. So, and could you imagine that Troll Sorting, which is the head of World Economic Forum Center for Cybersecurity now, he was the CISO of Barclays Group. He has received through CDA channel our information. So, and he is a close friend of Mr. Chairman of Maersk, Jim Snabe. So he has sent the information to Jim. And Jim said, okay, guys, we have to just check this utility. So they have checked, agreed that everything is fine. So Jim received my mobile phone from Trolls and called me, and I have sent the people, and we have helped Maersk to recover their systems. It took 1 week. Could you imagine the real-time platform in which I just can upload such kind of data and everybody will access to that in an automatical way? Because now it is working between people. It's just like, the post with pigeons, yes, and it's working like that, yes. And we have to do something, and we recognized, and we had several meetings in Davos last year in January, no, this year in January. So, we decided to build the Center for Cybersecurity of the World Economic Forum because World Economic Forum is an entity which integrates more than 90% of world GDP. So, and this is a good platform for collaboration. And now we are trying to build the platform to integrate all this data from all sources around the globe. And I hope if next incident like NotPetya will happen, the losers would be not so big. Yeah.
Right, the time has come to wrap up. So we're going to turn to our audience one last time to answer the question that we've been essentially debating for the last hour. Let's have our final audience question poll. And again, we'll have 10 seconds. Is a cyber 9/11 attack that completely redraws the battle lines going to happen in the next 10 years? So yes or no, 10 seconds, please. Looking fairly definitive. Pessimists in the room. Before we get thrown out of the room, I'm going to pose the same question to our panelists. A simple yes or no, and then a simple one sentence to explain why. Troy.
Oh, you know, I don't like yes or no questions. I'm going to say yes, just simply because there is so much opportunity for it to happen.
Jackie.
Yes, and I just think there are too many people that don't really understand the full impact of their actions working as adversaries on the internet.
And Dmitry.
I think 10 years is too wide range. I think it will happen sooner.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today for the big debate. Please join me again in thanking our panelists, Troy Hans, Jacqueline McNamara, and Dmitry Samartsev. Thank you very much.
Thank you.